How can we do that? No, probably we cannot do it in a widespread way. I have no magic, and I doubt it that anyone else in this room or in this city or in this country has a magic potion that would make vast numbers of people in our society very conscious overnight. No, it doesn't exist. But somehow there has always been a strange kind of esoteric intimation. Valentinus, the great Gnostic teacher, said it in some words, others have put it in other ways, and that was that every time one individual human soul truly achieves gnosis, true great consciousness comes about in just one person, the flaw of the collective is thereby, to a certain extent, rectified. Numbers don't matter so much. The quality of the change of consciousness matters. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, said Jesus. He didn't say, where all the millions of the world are gathered together, then I will deign to come and take a look at them. You know, 2 or 3. Once again, being obsessed with numbers is again that karma, that desire going out and judging things by extroverted standards. So the issue is, let us bring the strength of consciousness to bear on the process as it exists within ourselves and outside. And then the possibility of remedy is great. The next step is the entry of the psyche into the process of creative conflict. We don't like conflict. Curiously enough, we don't like it, but it always arises again and again, especially in the Theosophical Society. That's the one association that is very dear to our hearts, so we see it there all the time. But I assure you, it exists elsewhere. You know, you study the history of churches, you study the history of various movements, and they fight like cats and dogs, just like a bunch of theosophists. And sometimes worse, you know, and they also advocate brotherhood, sisterhood, cousinhood, niecehood, you name it, but they still fight, you know. It's just part of these curious tendencies of human nature, but that is not, of course, those are projections and externalizations of the creative conflict that exists within and that really exists at the heart of the universe. We need to recognize that at least certain forms of spiritual transcendental growth do not come about as the result of a straight, linear movement from one point to the other, but rather they come about by way of the often, at least temporarily, conflictual interaction of polar opposite forces. And so the issue is not for the manas, the mind, to win out over karma and the physical, or even of the intuitive of the spiritual to win out over the rest, but for them to interact creatively with each other, and somehow each contributing to the alchemy bring about a creative transformed totality that can literally give birth to a new world. This is perhaps a direction that is a little bit more difficult for most theosophists, as it might be to some other people whom I know, Jungians and so forth. Although in some places there is quite an overlap, like in the glorious land of kangaroos into which our beloved and respected Joy Mills is about to sally with the coming of the new year. When I was there quite a number of years ago, the C.G. Jung Society in Sydney met at Blavatsky Lodge, and there were about half the same people there that were at the Theosophical meeting. So Well, there is hope, at least in Australia. And I'm sure that some more hope and joy will be brought there soon. So, well, it'll be certainly the loss of the Ojai Valley and of America, but hopefully in due course it will be remedied. And just look out for the changes in character and behavior that may come about when Joy Mills comes back, you know, when she'll wear one of those big hats and slap you on the back and say, "She be right, mate," and things like that. There is something about Australians that you don't find anywhere else. It's very, very, very amazing. Now, because in our myth, and more in the formulations of our myth, a great deal of emphasis has been placed on the concept of evolution. Evolution was the big buzzword on HPB's day, but I firmly believe that if one truly investigates what HPB meant by evolution, we will find that it's something very, very different from Haeckel and Darwin and Lamarck and all of these people. It was sufficiently close, apparently, in certain respects, that she thought that she could get away with it and kind of hook up her own very, very different and transcendental idea about the development of the human being with these outer things in the culture. But we nevertheless have somewhat assumed that notion that it's a more or less straight line of growth from one point to the other, and the alchemical paradigm of the interacting of the forces for the purpose of the ultimate change is not something that we are so much at home with. Yet we have to be, because it is part of our nature, and it is part of the great mechanism whereby the world transforms and we transform. So that we have to familiarize ourselves with that. That doesn't mean, however, that we need to agree with all the extremes that are involved in the transformation process. Somebody asked me this afternoon about some of the extreme tendencies in our culture that I sort of make fun of and call them flapdoodles and different things of that sort. And they're usually the popular ones, and said, well, aren't they part of the alchemy? And I said, yes, they are ingredients of the alchemy, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Because we must maintain the sovereignty of our own consciousness and still evaluate according to the standards of our insight whether these various phenomena in the culture are valid from our point of view or not. But they play their role and ultimately they have their utility. So to become affinitized to this mode of change. And there is one great trick in it. And that is that, as I have mentioned on the various earlier discussions, the alchemist does not make the transformation happen. So we as the human ego cannot take credit for this change. This is a sacrifice we must make. If we give up the blame and the guilt, as I mentioned before, then we can't take the credit either. You know, you can't have one without. We would love to do that. Yes, I made it happen, and moreover, I never made a mistake, and I am not sinful, and I am not guilty. So that, you know, but it can't. You can't have it. But then, who makes it happen? The Taoists would say the great Tao happens. And so we need to recognize that there is a divine momentum that moves the transformation of our souls. And we as the ego can stand beside the alchemical retort of the totality of our psyche and assist it to the best of our ability. But we don't make it happen, and as such we can't take credit for the happening either. Now, this is very different from the Victorian notion of growth, or the facilitating or the bringing about of growth by way of rigid discipline. I make myself do this, I make myself do that, and more importantly, I stop myself from doing a myriad things. Well, much of that may still be necessary. We have to make choices, certain things to do, certain things not to do. But don't think that the transformation depends on that. In fact, for most of the do's and the don'ts that we are so attached to, it couldn't care less. Maybe we care, and if we care for realistic reasons, that is quite all right. But remember, we don't make this happen. We are not in charge. At least we, the ego, is not in charge. Something greater, something transpersonal perhaps rather than impersonal, something vast and magnificent is in charge. And what can we do? Don't stand in its way. Get out of the way. Let it happen. And if we can do that, then the transformation moves and takes place. Now, I have not said very much about the body politic. I have talked about the individual. And let's have a government that will be there like a benign alchemist, a caretaker, will see that great extremes and terrible developments won't take place, but let's trust the people for once. Let's trust the individual within the people that he is divine in origin, that there is a divine potential within the citizens, that they can be sensible, they can be rational, they can be wise, ultimately they even can be spiritual. And they don't have to be made into that. They are that already, potentially. It's a matter of a release of a potential rather than of making anybody into that. There is the wise alchemist as against the tyrannical power that is always trying to make things happen, always tries to do and ends up undoing. This is the reverse of Mephistopheles in Faust of Goethe, where Mephistopheles introduces himself, I am that force that always desires evil and still accomplishes good. But there is a side to that, and there is a very strong one in our culture. We are the makers, we are the doers, we are the fixers. And in all of our making and doing and fixing, we undo as much as we do. The late Mr. Manly Hall of blessed memory, in whose society I've been speaking now just a little over 20 years, every week when I'm there. And of course, Mr. Hall's, the 2nd anniversary of his death will be next month. And every year, once a year, he gave some talks on the signs of the zodiac and gave advice to people sort of under the very thin excuse of astrology. And he always brought it in at some point. This year, be very careful with do-it-yourself projects. He would say, it is well proven that more accidents happen in the home in the course of do-it-yourself projects than on our freeways or anywhere else. He always brought it in some fashion. The phrase was always there, and of course it was always applicable. And it's true in our life in general. We are so anxious to go in there and fix things, and we do it without insight, we do it without consciousness, we do it without guidance, and of course consequently we undo. Without in any way wishing to be political, because the statement could have been said by any number of our politicians on both sides of the aisle, you know, we do need the vision thing. We do need the vision thing. And then things work. The next and very important element is the conjunction of the opposites. After and as the result of the conflictual interaction within us. Things come together, that the opposites are destined to meet. And a recognition has to be given to that. So that the opposites, none of the extremes are ever truly right. That doesn't mean that sometimes we don't espouse them. But realize that when one position has a certain validity, on the other side, there is a balancing position which has some validity too. Don't exclude the opposite of your temporary point of view from the picture, but realize that something has to come out of that. So whether you're a conservative or a liberal or a libertarian or whatever, conservative Republican or a progressive Republican, whether you think that change is never needed or whether it's just not needed now, which is the definition of some people. In any case, always remember, ultimately you can't do without that, small as it may be, some valid core in the opposition, and look for the extraction of that and the understanding of that, even from the Puritan, even from the Marxist, even from Jerry Falwell, whoever. These are sort of my major devils. You may have your own. You know, we all are entitled to our own demonology. You know? But there is something there of value but we have to extract it. We have to bring it forth. And if that is kept in mind, then the conjunction of the opposites becomes a very real possibility. And then comes a rather transcendental and obscure point, which I have called redemption. But various other terms could be applied to it. Jung says something very interesting in volume 11 of his collected writings. Existence is only real when it is conscious to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, the conscious human, even though from sheer unconsciousness he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious. And another statement Jung made, whoever knows God has an effect on him. Obviously he was not talking about Blavatsky's God. He was not talking about the Parabrahman, but about the great archetypal sort of managing and governing forces of the cosmos and of this world, and perhaps even of our society. So it's really a restatement of something I said earlier, by becoming increasingly conscious, by attaining to that kind of gnosis, we also curiously and mysteriously confer consciousness and gnosis on these great powers. Now, it's easy to say, and it's a truth on another level, that an informed, a conscious electorate and so forth will produce, in a perfectly logical way, will bring about a better government. And that, as Jefferson I believe said, that it will never be, it has never been before, that ignorant people will be free. So one might say unconscious people will not remain free very much longer, but there is even much more to it than that. We can help to redeem the universe, and we can help to redeem society by coming closer and closer to our authentic selfhood, to real consciousness. These principles can all be applied to the body politic, as I mentioned before, in various ways, and some of these we have indicated already. So I will just mention one or two of these. Americans need to recognize that creative conflict, for instance, is not the same as neurotic conflict. That there is such a thing as a creative conflict. That conflict is not always bad. Conflicts of a creative nature must be born. Once again, sometimes the condition has to get a lot worse before it can get better. We have to have the intuition, the insight to see when we are in a situation where we need to step in, or someone needs to step in and do something about it right now, like one would do in the case of a broken pipe or a house on fire, and not argue about it. As Buddha pointed out, often to seek in great detail analytically the origins of certain conditions is not all that helpful. Buddha said, if your house is on fire, what do? Do you go put it out? Or do you start asking all kinds of questions? How did the fire start? Who set it? What happened? Was it an electrical fire? Oh no, Buddha didn't say that, sorry. Well, maybe he with a certain clairvoyant prevision. But all the various questions. No, you do what you can to put it out. Or if you're shot, your body is shot through with an arrow, do you ask, who shot the arrow? Was the man tall? Was he short? Was he dark-haired? Was he light-skinned? Whatever. No, pull the arrow out and seek healing. One can get too inquisitive, too analytical about things. The intellect is good at that sort of thing. But so we have to have the insight to know when these things can be looked at and accomplished, now when we can actually do something about it, and when we must grit our teeth and grin or not grin, but bear the situation until it comes to a useful conclusion, a useful fruition, when the philosopher's stone can really come out of the situation. Let us remember that in most cases, the most productive result in a conflictual situation such as our society, such as our situation here in America, will not come about if one polar opposite, if one side wins out. But rather when, as the result of the prolonged interaction of the opposites, something arises that is greater and better than all of them. And so we make certain decisions that are temporary. I think we are bound to admit, at least I am bound to admit, that the economic system of free enterprise, if it ever could be really free, or a free market, if it ever would be free, everybody talks about it, but nobody really has it, is vastly preferable to a managed economy such as we had in all the various Marxist countries, which have proven to be monumental failures. And that with all of its shortcomings, the quote capitalist system has much in its favor when compared with any of the existing systems. Yet, let us leave a small door open to something else. Let us realize that ultimately even the great achievements which we have benefited by need to absorb some of their opposite and thereby attain to something ultimately greater and indeed to the coming wholeness. And so what is needed is an individual affinity to the process of becoming whole. Always accompanied, however, by the recognition that this process of becoming whole requires, as an absolute prerequisite and accompanying circumstance, an optimum degree of personal freedom. Freedom to be, freedom not to be. I'm all for Dr. Kevorkian. If under certain circumstances people want not to be, well then to be or not to be has been resolved in that fashion. I am not a great friend personally of suicide, although I hold with the existentialists that anyone who hasn't tried it hasn't really lived. You know, some existentialists said it at some point. Well, they should have. They certainly meant it. Well, it's kind of like you're, you know, you're always positive and upbeat. There's obviously something you are not seeing, you know, and that you just don't understand the situation. But at the same time, the government does not own anyone's life. Someone else owns that. To punish people for attempting suicide is simply the statement that you are owned by the government. I even suggested at some point, well, all right, if that's the position, then why don't you make attempted suicide a capital offense? You see? What? If you didn't succeed in doing it, we'll do it for you. And actually, a very large number of the laws and ordinances of governments, both national and local, make just about that much sense. You know, just about that much sense. But behind all of this concern for freedom, there must be that kind of spiritual understanding. We wish to be free not just in order to do any blessed thing that comes into our heads, but in order to have the optimum possibilities and capacities for spiritual transformation, for the greater development. And as I tried to indicate this evening, as I indicated in the other material, which I sort of revamped a little bit every time, I am convinced, both on the basis of my studies over a good many years and on the basis of my intuition, which told me even before I came to this country well over 40 years ago, that there is something special about this land, about this nation, that something very, very important has been trying to happen here all throughout its history, and that what has been started here has been started by agencies far greater, far wiser, far more deeply inspired than just ordinary politicians and revolutionaries in the American Revolution, and that somehow there is still a possibility of that hope being realized. And I know of no more qualified people than you to pay attention to that and to help with the full dedication of our consciousness, dedication to wholeness, dedication to greatness, dedication to the realization of our own divinity and thereby the redemption of the world, to help to bring that about. And if our presence here together this evening, these days, this weekend, and this conference dedicated to freedom has even made a tiny little move in that direction, then our time has been well spent, and our presence will have contributed to great and wonderful results. May that be so, indeed, may that be so, and I thank you very much.
After his talk, Professor Hoeller answered audience members' questions. Due to recording limitations, we re-asked the questions in the studio. The first question came from a person who noted an apparent contradiction between the speaker's stated views against religious orthodoxy and his actual statements. At one point, Professor Hoeller had said that the seeker after truth first needs to recognize that something is wrong. To the questioner, this sounded very much like the orthodox concept of original sin. Later, Professor Hoeller said that we cannot control the alchemical process, but that we must get out of the way and let it happen. This statement to the questioner sounded very much like the concept of providential grace. In the light of these statements, the questioner then queried Professor Hoeller as to whether or not he is actually a crypto-Augustinian.
Very good question. Next question, please. No, that is a very astute observation, and my answer to that would be that you really recognized something very important there. That once again, indeed, in the Augustinian position, which I have attacked so heavily over these days. And within the most orthodox forms of monotheistic religiosity, or other religiosities as well, of course, there is concealed more than a grain of truth. As I have grown older and perhaps a little bit more tolerant of positions which are not my own, I have increasingly come to recognize that the trouble with, say, Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox Judaism is not so much that these points of view are false and wrong. The notions of the fall, of a corrupted creation, are based on basically valid observations. Because I think within us there is a deep-seated memory of a condition and a world and a life that is vastly more glorious and full and in every respect more satisfactory than the one within which we live. We sense that we have come down a few notches somewhere along the line. But when that is interpreted in the crude manner of a couple of people listening to a talking snake, and all the cosmic and eternal consequences ensuing from that, then we have given a wrongful twist to that recognition. Madame Blavatsky is one of HPB's statements, I think from ISIS, but wherever it is, it's an accurate quotation, is to the effect, superstition is truth materialized. One of the few quotations that I've memorized completely because it's short. And so I think that is the true of what might be called superstitions or twisted beliefs in various quarters. They do have a basic truth, but it has become excessively materialized. And so these notions of the fall and so forth have to be intuitively grasped as something in our own spiritual history, when from the paradisical vast worlds of light we have come into a condition appreciably different from and much more gross and much more dark than that. So I think that what you have said is very, very true, but I'm still not an Augustinian. Yes?
I know that even though you have lived in the United States for the past 40 years, you are originally from Eastern Europe, and that you have kept abreast of the struggle that is occurring there. It seems that what is occurring in America right now, especially with some Americans' apparent dissatisfaction with their own political system and its leaders, is perhaps a reverberation of the efforts for democracy that are taking place elsewhere, like in Russia and the other Eastern European countries. With America having the unique position of representing the greatest force for democracy in the world, it seems like world events may be pushing Americans to rediscover what democracy means for them, and what course they should chart from this point on. Do you agree with this, and can you comment further?
I couldn't agree more, and I think that in many ways the miracle, because that is really one way to characterize it, that has occurred over the last 2 or 3 years in certain parts of the world, is an immense challenge to ourselves, to the Western democracies, and particularly to the land which, whether it wanted it or not, has fallen into the position of leadership within that fold. And the challenge is very similar to what you pointed out. I think you alluded to it very well. The challenge is now here you are the democratic countries, you have stood for this freedom all along. How free are you really? How sincere are you? How well is this greatly desired commodity working within your structure? Are you really an example of how great and wonderful and creative and ultimately just freedom can be, or are you not? and the eyes of these peoples are riveted on us. What are we going to do about that? So this is a time, I think, for the Western democracies and for the United States to really take stock of their own moral position and of their entire system, and see that if they begin increasingly to appear as just another failure or be very, very gravely flawed, we will not only harm ourselves and our people, as in many ways, of course, we are doing all along, but we are going to let some of the most deserving peoples of the world down. We are going to let them down. We are going to cause a terrible disappointment. And I think this is a great moral responsibility. Are the American people, the French people, the German people, the others, are they going to rise to this or not? I think they can. Maybe this challenge is going to work the trick. And I think they will, the newly freed people will have contributions to make to us. And if we accept them, then we can enrich ourselves, I think, in a new and in a wonderful way. Jung, for one, has pointed out that Russia and America are two great alchemical opposites, the white and the red. And while the red now happily has ceased being red and has become blue, white, and red, the old flag of Peter the Great, I think we are still there with the capacity to enrich each other, but there is a great and grave responsibility that is with us, and it's more of a moral responsibility than it is financial or military or any other. I'm not going to give a little lecturette in response to every question, but these two were particularly stimulating, so forgive me. And anyone else, please?
Stephan, I'd like to ask you, for anyone who in the future may run for public office, how can what you have been talking about this evening be put into a language that is acceptable for a lot of people?
Well, I think I really have to think about that, but I think there are at least certain aspects of what we have said which are not that incapable of appreciation and assimilation by all sorts of people. I think the American people are at a deep psychological level, I think, very appreciative of and very attached to the mythos of freedom. And I think they're also aware of their responsibility in terms of that mythos to others. You know, there was a little incident that not too many people have paid so much attention to at the time of and right after the Tiananmen Square massacre and difficulties there. What was the symbol, what was the statue that the Chinese freedom held up? The Statue of Liberty. This is the American goddess. You want a goddess? You want the goddess? Don't just go after Gaia and things like that. Look at Lady Liberty, which in a mysterious way also joins us with France, just like the whole early history does. And this is alive in the American people. And I think it always will be alive. And also the capacity that others revere that, others want that, and that we have a way of making it available to them, that we can help them do that, rings a chord in the American people. I have talked to a lot of people in the course of this year about Tibet, because His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama declared the just past year from March to March as the year of Tibet. And I was in all kinds of places among all sorts of people who are not very interested in spiritual things. When I mentioned to them the terrible need and the terrible suffering of the Tibetan people and their great desire for liberty and how they want something that we don't have and that we could in some ways help them to know, I had wonderful responses everywhere. There is much more good in the American people than we suspect. Yes, sometimes we can burn down houses in cities and we can do all kinds of stupid things, but we still have an archetypal reverence for freedom. And that is not a false thing, and it's not a distortion. It's based on something very, very wonderful. And if we catch people on that keynote, I think we can stimulate their thinking and their dedications into some very desirable directions. There's still a great and wonderful potential here.